Margaret Chun sat in the back corner of the packed courtroom, her small frame almost disappearing into the wooden bench. At 72 years old, she looked like any other elderly woman who might have wandered into the wrong building. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her simple blue cardigan hung loosely on her thin shoulders. The walking cane beside her completed the picture of frailty that everyone saw when they glanced her way. The case being heard was one of the most significant in the city's recent history. A massive corporation, Titan Industries, was being sued for environmental damage that had poisoned 3 neighborhoods and left dozens of families homeless. The company's legal team filled 2 entire rows, their expensive suits and briefcases creating an intimidating wall of corporate power. Judge Harrison presided over the proceedings with his usual stern demeanor. Known throughout the legal community as a no-nonsense judge who rarely showed emotion, he had a reputation for being particularly tough on what he considered frivolous lawsuits. The plaintiff's attorney, a young woman named Sarah Martinez, was fighting an uphill battle against Titan's army of lawyers. Margaret had been sitting quietly for 3 hours, listening to the corporate lawyers dismiss the community's suffering as minor inconveniences and unproven claims. The families affected by the toxic waste were mostly working-class people who couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that Titan Industries commanded. Their stories of sick children, contaminated water, and destroyed homes were being systematically torn apart by highly paid legal experts. As the afternoon wore on, the proceedings became increasingly one-sided. Titan's lead attorney, Mr. Blackwood, presented chart after chart showing how their client had followed all regulations. He painted the affected families as opportunists seeking easy money from a successful company. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a case of this magnitude. The turning point came when Judge Harrison seemed ready to dismiss several key pieces of evidence. Margaret watched as Sarah Martinez's shoulders sagged slightly. The young lawyer had fought valiantly, but she was drowning in the corporate machine's endless resources and legal maneuvering. That was when Margaret slowly rose from her seat. The movement was so quiet and gentle that hardly anyone noticed at first. She steadied herself with her cane and began walking toward the front of the courtroom. Her steps were careful and measured, the soft tap of her cane against the floor barely audible above the legal arguments. "Your Honor," she said, her voice nothing more than a whisper that somehow carried through the entire courtroom. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at this small, elderly woman who had dared to interrupt the proceedings. Judge Harrison frowned and adjusted his glasses. "Ma'am, this courtroom is in session. Please return to your seat, or I'll have to ask you to leave." Margaret continued her slow walk forward, unperturbed by the judge's warning. When she reached the barriers separating the gallery from the court proper, she stopped and looked directly at Judge Harrison. Her eyes, which had seemed tired and distant just moments before, now held a steel-like intensity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. "Your Honor," she repeated, her voice still quiet but somehow commanding more attention than any of the shouting lawyers had managed all day. "I believe there are some things this court needs to know before any decisions are made." The corporate lawyers immediately objected, rising to their feet in unison like a well-trained military unit. Mr. Blackwood's voice boomed across the courtroom as he demanded that this random spectator be removed immediately. The families in the gallery leaned forward, unsure of what was happening, but sensing that something important was unfolding. Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence, his eyes fixed on Margaret with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but you cannot simply interrupt court proceedings. This is highly irregular." Margaret nodded respectfully, acknowledging his concern while maintaining her position. "I understand, Your Honor, but I think you'll find that my testimony is not only relevant, but essential to this case. My name is Margaret Chun, and 43 years ago, I was the lead environmental scientist for the federal agency that first investigated Titan Industries." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Several of the corporate lawyers immediately began whispering urgently among themselves. Mr. Blackwood's confident expression faltered for the first time all day. Sarah Martinez looked up with renewed hope, realizing that an unexpected ally had just emerged. But Margaret wasn't finished. She reached into her small purse and withdrew a worn manila envelope, its edges yellowed with age. I have documents here that were never made public. Documents that show Titan Industries knew exactly what their waste disposal practices would do to the surrounding communities. They knew, and they chose profit over people's lives. The silence in the courtroom was now absolute. Even Judge Harrison seemed stunned by this turn of events. Margaret's transformation from a frail, elderly woman to a key witness was so complete that some people wondered if they were seeing the same person. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I've been carrying these documents for over 4 decades, waiting for the right moment to bring them to light. I've watched Titan Industries destroy community after community, always managing to escape consequences through their legal manipulations and political connections. But not today." Mr. Blackwood finally found his voice, though it lacked its earlier authority. "Your Honor, this is completely improper. We have no advance notice of this witness, no opportunity to examine these alleged documents. This is clearly a setup designed to prejudice our client." Margaret turned to look at the corporate lawyer, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Mr. Blackwood, isn't it interesting that you're so quick to object to evidence you haven't even seen? Almost as if you know exactly what these documents contain." The lawyer's face reddened, but before he could respond, Margaret turned back to the judge. It was then that she spoke the words that would change everything. They came out as barely a whisper, so quiet that only the people in the front rows could hear them clearly. "Nightingale 7-7. The effect on Judge Harrison was immediate and dramatic. His face went completely white, and he gripped the edges of his bench so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. For a moment, he looked like he might fall from his chair. The confident, stern judge who had been controlling the courtroom just minutes before now appeared shaken to his core. "Would you repeat that, please?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. Margaret smiled slightly, the first time her expression had softened since she'd stood up. "I said Nightingale 7-7, Your Honor. I believe you remember what that means." Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, his mind racing through memories he had buried decades ago. Nightingale 7-7 was a code name from his military service, from a mission he had thought was classified beyond any hope of public exposure. It was a name that connected him to events that had shaped his entire perspective on justice and corporate responsibility. The courtroom watched in fascination as their stern judge struggled to compose himself. Some of the corporate lawyers were clearly confused by what was happening, but Mr. Blackwood looked like he had seen a ghost. Margaret Chin stood quietly, waiting for the judge to process what she had just revealed. Finally, Judge Harrison cleared his throat and looked directly at Margaret. When he spoke, his voice carried a respect that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Chun, I think this court would very much like to hear what you have to say. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Chun to the witness stand." As Margaret made her way slowly to the witness stand, the entire atmosphere of the courtroom had shifted. The families in the gallery sat forward with new hope, while the corporate lawyers huddled together in urgent consultation. Sarah Martinez watched with growing excitement, realizing that her impossible case might suddenly have become winnable. But the biggest change was in Judge Harrison himself. The man who had seemed ready to dismiss the case an hour earlier now watched Margaret Chun with the intensity of someone who understood that everything was about to change. As she placed her hand on the Bible to be sworn in, her transformation from a seemingly frail, elderly woman to a powerful witness was complete. The whispered call sign had accomplished something that hours of legal arguments had failed to do. It had reminded Judge Harrison of who he used to be before he became comfortable with corporate power and legal technicalities. More importantly, it had announced that Margaret Chun was not the helpless old woman she appeared to be. She was someone who had been waiting 43 years for this moment, and she had just begun to fight. Margaret settled into the witness stand with the same careful movements she had used throughout the morning, but everything else about her had changed. The frail, elderly woman who had shuffled into the courtroom was now sitting straight-backed and alert, her eyes sharp and focused. Judge Harrison watched her intently, still processing the shock of hearing those 3 words that had transported him back to a different life. "Mrs. Chun," Sarah Martinez began, her voice containing barely controlled excitement, "would you please tell the court about your professional background?" Margaret adjusted the microphone with steady hands. "I serve as a senior environmental scientist with the Environmental Protection Agency for 31 years. Before that, I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in environmental impact assessment. During the early 1980s, I was part of a special task force investigating industrial waste management practices across the country." The corporate lawyers were frantically passing notes between themselves. Mr. Blackwood kept glancing at Judge Harrison, clearly disturbed by the judge's reaction to whatever Margaret had whispered. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become electric with tension. "And did your work bring you into contact with Titan Industries?" Sarah continued. "Yes, extensively," Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger. "In 1982, we received reports of groundwater contamination in 3 states where Titan had disposal facilities. I was assigned as the lead investigator because of my background in chemical waste analysis." Margaret reached for the manila envelope she had placed beside her. "What I discovered during that investigation was a pattern of deliberate environmental destruction that went far beyond simple negligence. Titan Industries had developed a systematic approach to waste disposal that they knew would contaminate groundwater, soil, and air quality in surrounding communities." "Objection!" Mr. Blackwood shouted, finally finding his voice. "These are allegations about events from 40 years ago that have no bearing on the current case. This witness was not disclosed in discovery, and we have no opportunity to verify these claims." Judge Harrison looked at the corporate lawyer with an expression that would have frozen water. "Overruled." "Continue, Mrs. Chun." Margaret opened her envelope and withdrew a thick stack of documents, each page carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "These are internal Titan Industries memos, chemical analysis reports, and correspondence between company executives and their environmental consultants. They were obtained during our 1982 investigation through proper legal channels." She held up the first document, a memo dated March 15, 1982. "This is from Titan's Vice President of Operations to their Board of Directors. It explicitly states, and I quote, 'The new disposal method will reduce our costs by approximately 60% annually. Environmental impact studies suggest significant groundwater contamination is likely, but legal analysis indicates potential liability costs are still below projected savings.'" A collective gasp rose from the gallery where the affected families sat. Several people wiped away tears as they heard confirmation of what they had always suspected but could never prove. Their suffering had been calculated as an acceptable business expense. Sarah Martinez was practically trembling with excitement. "Mrs. Chun, why weren't these documents made public during the original investigation?" Margaret's expression darkened, and, for the first time, anger crept into her voice. "Because 3 weeks before our final report was due, I received orders to cease the investigation immediately. The case was classified under national security provisions that I later learned were completely fabricated." "Who gave those orders?" "The directive came through my supervisor, but it originated from much higher up the chain. Someone with enough influence to shut down a federal investigation and bury evidence of corporate environmental crimes." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Chun, what happened to your investigation team after the case was closed?" "2 of my colleagues were transferred to remote field offices within a month. Another was offered early retirement with enhanced benefits. I was reassigned to paperwork analysis in the EPA's basement filing department." Margaret's voice remained steady, but her hands tightened slightly on the documents. The message was clear. We were to forget what we had found, or our careers would be destroyed. The courtroom was completely silent except for the soft scratch of reporters' pens capturing every word. Even the corporate lawyers had stopped their frantic note-passing, realizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "But you didn't forget," Sarah prompted. "No, I didn't." Margaret looked directly at the families in the gallery. "I made copies of every significant document before the case was shut down. I told myself I would find another way to expose the truth, but years passed, then decades. I watched Titan Industries continue their destructive practices, always staying one step ahead of regulators and investigators." She turned her attention to Mr. Blackwood and the team of corporate lawyers. "I watched them refine their legal strategies, buying influence and manipulating the system to avoid accountability. They became very good at making their victims look like opportunists, and their crimes look like simple business decisions." Mr. Blackwood's face had gone from red to pale during Margaret's testimony. He kept glancing at his phone, probably receiving urgent instructions from his firm's partners. "Your Honor, even if these documents are authentic, they relate to practices from 40 years ago. They have no relevance to the current allegations." Margaret smiled for the second time that day, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Mr. Blackwood, would you like to see the documents from 1997? Or perhaps the ones from 2003, 2009, and 2015? The lawyer's mouth fell open. Margaret reached into her envelope again and withdrew several more stacks of papers. "You see, after my official investigation was shut down, I never stopped investigating. I spent my own time and money tracking Titan Industries' environmental practices. I interviewed former employees, analyzed public water quality reports, and documented every suspicious incident." She held up a photograph showing a community playground next to a chain-link fence. Beyond the fence, chemical storage tanks were clearly visible. "This is Riverside Elementary School in Ohio, built in 2008. Titan Industries assured the community that their adjacent facility posed no health risks. Would you like to see the cancer rates for children who attended that school?" "Objection." Mr. Blackwood was on his feet again, but his voice lacked conviction. "Overruled," Judge Harrison said firmly. "Continue, Mrs. Chun." Margaret's voice took on the authoritative tone of someone who had spent decades building an airtight case. "For 41 years, I have documented every move Titan Industries made, every cover-up, every falsified report, every bribed official. I know about the children who developed leukemia in Oregon, the farmland that became uninhabitable in Kansas, and the fishing industry that collapsed in Louisiana." She opened another file and displayed a series of photographs. "I know about the secret facility in Nevada where they dumped their most toxic waste, telling the local government it was a water treatment plant. I have soil samples, water samples, and testimony from workers who were sworn to secrecy with threats to their family's safety." The courtroom was absolutely transfixed. This was no longer just a case about one contaminated neighborhood. Margaret Chun was revealing a decades-long pattern of environmental terrorism conducted by a major corporation. Judge Harrison found his voice. "Mrs. Chun, this is an extraordinary collection of evidence. Why are you coming forward now?" Margaret looked directly at him, and her next words carried the weight of 4 decades of patience and determination. "Because, Your Honor, I recently learned that I have terminal cancer. The doctors give me perhaps 6 months to live. I've spent 41 years building this case, and I won't take it to my grave." The emotional impact of her words was immediate and powerful. Several people in the gallery were openly crying, and even some of the court staff appeared moved. But Margaret wasn't seeking sympathy. "More importantly," she continued, "I learned that Titan Industries has plans to build their largest waste facility yet, right here in this city. The environmental impact study they've filed is almost identical to the fraudulent reports they've been using for 4 decades. They're planning to poison another community, and this time I have the power to stop them." Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what he was hearing. The case he had expected to dismiss as a simple civil dispute had transformed into something that could reshape environmental law and corporate accountability. But there was still the matter of the whispered code name that had started this transformation. Margaret seemed to read his thoughts. "Your Honor, I believe you have some understanding of why evidence like this might have been suppressed in the past. You know how powerful interests can influence even the most well-intentioned people in government positions. The judge's face tightened as he remembered things he had tried to forget. Nightingale 77 had been a military operation to investigate corporate contracts that were endangering soldiers' health. A young Army lawyer named James Harrison had been assigned to build a case against the contractors, but the investigation had been shut down through channels he never fully understood. Margaret continued, her voice gentle but insistent. Sometimes, Your Honor, we get a second chance to do what we know is right. Sometimes the universe gives us an opportunity to correct our past failures. Judge Harrison understood completely. Margaret Chun had just reminded him that he had once been someone who fought for justice instead of someone who enabled injustice. The whispered call sign had been more than just a way to get his attention. It had been a wake-up call to remember who he used to be before he became comfortable with the way things were. As Margaret organized her documents for the next phase of her testimony, the entire courtroom knew they were witnessing history. The frail, elderly woman who had seemed lost and confused just hours earlier had revealed herself to be perhaps the most dangerous witness Titan Industries had ever faced. And she was just getting started. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows seemed different now, as if the very air in the room had changed. Margaret Chun sat in the witness stand like a general who had just revealed her battle strategy, surrounded by 4 decades worth of evidence that could destroy one of the country's largest corporations. Judge Harrison had called a brief recess to allow both sides to prepare for what was clearly going to be an unprecedented continuation of testimony. During the break, Mr. Blackwood and his team of lawyers huddled in urgent conference, their phones buzzing constantly with calls from Titan Industries headquarters. The families in the gallery spoke in excited whispers, hardly daring to believe that their David versus Goliath case might actually have a chance. When court resumed, Margaret was ready with her most damaging evidence yet. She had spent the recess organizing her documents chronologically, creating a timeline that would be impossible to dispute or dismiss. Mrs. Chun, Sarah Martinez began, you mentioned that Titan Industries has planned for a new facility in this city. Could you elaborate on that? Margaret nodded and withdrew a thick blue folder from her collection. 3 months ago, Titan submitted an environmental impact statement for a new research facility to be built on the east side of the city. According to their application, it will employ 300 people and focus on innovative waste management solutions. She opened the folder and displayed a site map. What their application doesn't mention is that this facility will be Titan's largest chemical waste processing plant, designed to handle toxic materials from 17 states. They're calling a research facility to avoid stricter environmental regulations. The courtroom erupted in surprised voices. Many of the people present lived on the east side of the city or had family members who would be directly affected by such a facility. How do you know this? Sarah asked. Because Margaret said, pulling out another document, this is the exact same blueprint they used for their facility in Michigan in 2019. I obtained a copy of their real construction plans through a former employee who contacted me last year. Mr. Blackwood shot to his feet. Your Honor, this witness is making serious allegations based on documents of questionable authenticity. We demand to examine these materials immediately. Judge Harrison looked at the corporate lawyer with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Blackwood, your client will have every opportunity to challenge Mrs. Chin's evidence during cross-examination. Until then, sit down and listen. The force of the judge's words sent Mr. Blackwood back to his seat like a scolded child. The transformation in Judge Harrison's demeanor was remarkable. The man who had seemed ready to rubber-stamp Titan's legal victory was now actively protecting their most dangerous witness. Margaret continued her testimony with methodical precision. The Michigan facility was built using the same fraudulent environmental impact study. Within 18 months of opening, it contaminated the groundwater for a radius of 12 miles. 16 children in nearby schools developed respiratory problems, and the local cancer rate increased by 300%. She displayed photographs of the Michigan site, showing dead vegetation and warning signs around contaminated water sources. Titan Industries paid $47 million in settlements to affected families, but they never admitted wrongdoing. More importantly, they never changed their practices. Sarah Martinez was taking notes furiously, realizing that Margaret's testimony was providing enough evidence to file dozens of additional lawsuits. Mrs. Chun, do you have evidence that Titan knew these health problems would occur? I have something better than knowledge, Margaret replied, reaching for yet another file. I have their internal cost-benefit analysis that calculated the exact financial trade-off between preventing the contamination and paying the eventual settlements. The document she produced was a spreadsheet titled Michigan Project Risk Assessment. Margaret read directly from it. Estimated health-related litigation costs, $43 to $55 million. Estimated cost of implementing proper containment systems, $87 million. Recommended action: proceed with standard containment and budget for settlement costs. The families in the gallery were now openly weeping. To hear their children's health problems described as a calculated business expense was almost unbearable. Several people stood up and left the courtroom, unable to listen to more evidence of such callous disregard for human life. Judge Harrison's face had gone completely pale. Mrs. Chun, you're alleging that Titan Industries deliberately poisoned communities because it was cheaper than following proper safety procedures? I'm not alleging it, Your Honor. I'm documenting it with their own internal communications. Margaret's voice was steady and professional, but her eyes blazed with controlled fury. This company has been conducting a 40-year campaign of environmental terrorism against working-class communities, safe in the knowledge that their victims couldn't afford to fight back. Mr. Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to derail her testimony. Your Honor, even assuming these documents are genuine, this witness has no legal standing in this case. She's not a party to the lawsuit. She wasn't properly disclosed, and her testimony is clearly prejudicial. Judge Harrison turned to look at the corporate lawyer with an expression that made several people in the courtroom actually flinch. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had rediscovered his moral compass. Mr. Blackwood, this court is going to hear every word Mrs. Chun has to say. If your client has a problem with that, they're welcome to appeal my decision. But I suspect that when this testimony becomes public record, Titan Industries is going to have much bigger problems to worry about. Margaret smiled at the judge's words, but her expression quickly became serious again. Your Honor, there's something else this court needs to know, something that connects directly to the current case. She reached for a final folder, this one marked with red tape and labeled immediate threat. 2 weeks ago, I received a phone call from a current Titan Industries employee, someone with access to their executive communications who was disturbed by what they were seeing. The courtroom held its breath as Margaret opened this last file. Even Mr. Blackwood seemed hypnotized by the unfolding revelation. This employee informed me that Titan Industries has been monitoring this lawsuit very carefully. They know that if they lose this case, it could open the floodgates for similar lawsuits across the country. Their potential liability could reach into the billions of dollars. Margaret displayed a series of printed emails. These are communications between Titan's executive team and their special projects division. They discuss various strategies for ensuring that this case doesn't set a legal precedent. Sarah Martinez leaned forward. What kind of strategies? Intimidation of witnesses, investigation of the plaintiff's personal lives looking for anything that could discredit them, and pressure on local officials to influence the court's decision. Margaret's voice became harder with each word. But most disturbing of all, they discussed accelerating their timeline for the new facility here in the city. She held up the final document, and her voice dropped to almost a whisper. They want to break ground next month, before any legal decision could stop them. Once construction begins, they know it will be almost impossible to halt the project. The implications of this revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Titan Industries wasn't just defending against this lawsuit. They were actively working to create more victims while the legal process played out. Judge Harrison had heard enough. He stood up from his bench, his decision made. Mrs. Chun, thank you for your courage in bringing this information to light. This court is going to take immediate action. He turned to address the entire courtroom, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had remembered why he became a judge in the first place. I am hereby issuing an immediate injunction against Titan Industries' proposed construction project. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the allegations presented today. Mr. Blackwood jumped to his feet one last time, his voice desperate. Your Honor, you cannot make those decisions based on unverified testimony from a single witness. Judge Harrison looked down at the corporate lawyer, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of 4 decades of suppressed conscience. Mr. Blackwood, I've spent too many years listening to corporate lawyers explain why their clients shouldn't be held responsible for the harm they cause. Today, that ends. He turned back to Margaret, who was carefully organizing her documents. Mrs. Chun, these materials will be entered into evidence and immediately forwarded to the State Attorney General's office and the Environmental Protection Agency. I suspect they'll be very interested in what you've uncovered. Margaret nodded with satisfaction. Thank you, Your Honor. I've been waiting 41 years for someone in authority to take these crimes seriously. As she slowly rose from the witness stand, helped by the bailiff, Margaret Chin completed her transformation from frail, elderly woman to the architect of corporate justice. The whispered call sign had not just reminded Judge Harrison of his former self. It had awakened him to his current responsibility. The families in the gallery were crying tears of joy now, finally, believing that their suffering might be acknowledged and their community might be protected. Titan Industries' army of lawyers sat in stunned silence, realizing that their clients' decades of environmental crimes were about to become front-page news across the country. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Judge Harrison himself. The man who had walked into court that morning ready to dismiss another frivolous lawsuit against a major corporation was now leading the charge for justice. Margaret's whispered words had reminded him that some things are more important than legal technicalities and corporate influence. As Margaret made her slow way back to her seat in the gallery, she passed the corporate lawyer's table. Mr. Blackwood looked up at her with something approaching fear in his eyes. She stopped for just a moment and smiled at him. Mr. Blackwood, she said in that same soft whisper that had started everything, you might want to advise your client to start budgeting for much larger settlements. And perhaps they should consider a new line of business. The frail, elderly woman who had shuffled into the courtroom that morning walked out as the architect of the largest corporate environmental prosecution in the state's history. Her whispered call sign had not just forced a judge to bow down. It had brought down an entire system of corporate immunity that had protected environmental criminals for decades. Margaret Chin had spent 41 years waiting for justice. On this day, she finally delivered it.